Here goes nothing. We have fans. We have pump. We have water moving. Thought we should have had light. There we go.
Alright, so what this is going to be kind of the simple version of water cooling the InWin A1 chassis. Now, this is somewhat dependent on the hardware that I have specifically, but I will kind of go over some other options if, for example, you don't have a small graphics card or perhaps an SFX power supply. But first thing that I needed to do in order to make this happen was to remove the kind of bottom foot assembly. So there's just 4 screws that hold that in place, and then it comes right out. And then there's this little kind of light thing that kind of just sits inside that bottom pedestal. And you need to pull that out, fish the wires back out of there, and we won't need that until we get back into the end, because we have a few slight modifications that we will have to do to the chassis. So the first and really only modification that I have to do here is just using a kind of radiator template thing to guide my center punch. So I basically just line that up, keeping it in the center over the mesh because I want to basically keep the fan locations the same, but just using a spring-loaded center punch here to mark out the holes to drill, and there's just going to be 8 of them because I'm going to be using a 240 millimeter radiator in the bottom. And I'm using a Hardware Labs radiator, so they have M3 screws, so I'm just grabbing a drill bit that's slightly bigger than the screw size. So that way when I go through, there'll be just a little bit of wiggle room for those screws in case things aren't perfectly aligned, because that is always a possibility. So here you can see I've added some tape, and that's just basically to prevent scratches from any of the metal that might get wrapped around the drill bit and start twisting around. So you just kind of drill out all 8 holes, and then the next thing that I'll do here is grab the countersink bit just to kind of clean up those drilled holes, deburr them a little bit so that there's no sharp pieces, and then we can get rid of the tape. Now with the radiator in place, I have, this is like, I think it's a Bitfinex bracket, and I chose this one because it allows you to move the pump reservoir combo back and forth and side to side, so you can kind of line it up wherever you need to.
Okay, so we've got the case all set up here. You have to use an SFX power supply unless you use an even smaller reservoir pump combo, or you find somewhere else to put the reservoir. Use a different style, whatever. I think one of the easier things to do would be if you had the kind of reservoir that you could just mount on this rear fan mount, and probably skip this radiator. You might want to do that if you're looking for the easy route, because like I said, you have to go with the SFX power supply, which isn't bad, but now the only way to really get at the cover for this is you have to get up underneath the power supply to loosen that cap off, and then yeah, this is, well, it was the easiest configuration for me to figure out as far as getting the actual water cooling stuff in there. GTX 760, yeah, I know it's a little bit old, but I have it. I have a backplate and a water block for it. Have never actually used it, so that's why it's in here. It is short. It's about the same length, a little bit longer than the ITX motherboard. So something like one of those 1070, 1080 ITX versions, or like an R9 Nano if you still had one of those. Maybe if the Vega Nano. Anyway, the short GPU is pretty much the only thing that's making this possible for me. If you had a longer GPU, as long as you could still get your fittings out, I think you'd still be fine. You just have to relocate the pump and reservoir. So if that was the case, I'd probably end up putting it over here. Again, I don't know if I would end up doing this back radiator or not, just because, I mean, if you were to try and use this, like one of those EK pump mounting brackets and moving it over here and trying to still get at your CPU cooler and everything, I think that just, it'd probably be a little bit tough. Obviously, if this is what you want to do, you have to water cool your graphics card, because I mean, there's just obviously not enough room here to get that radiator along with a graphics card with a cooler on it that isn't a water block. So yeah, a couple of ideas that I kind of have rolling around is out of radiator into GPU, out of GPU into CPU, out of CPU into radiator, out of radiator back into the reservoir. Seems like that one should work fairly well. Another option that I was rolling around was out of the radiator into the CPU block, out of the CPU into the radiator, out of the radiator into the GPU, out of the GPU back into the reservoir. I'm probably going to end up having to play with that, and honestly, at this point, I think the only thing that I really need to determine is which I think looks better, which is cleaner, running out of the radiator into the graphics card or into the CPU. I don't know yet, so I'll probably start by trying to figure that part out, but I know obviously I'm going to use this import for the reservoir, coming back into the reservoir. Other than that, we'll figure it out. This is what I've come up with. I decided to go from radiator into the GPU and then from GPU into the CPU. Things got a little complicated because the stuff that I'm using, I mean, if I was using hard lines, it'd be a bigger problem. But I'm just using some relatively cheap or relatively inexpensive Alpha Cool tubing and Alpha Cool fittings because it's what I had a bunch of laying around. And so it's a little bit weird, like it's a little bit of an unorthodox loop. I think it's kind of interesting still, but you go from the radiator into the graphics card, so that's pretty straightforward and pretty easy. I didn't like it going up to there because to try and make this corner and clear the RAM, and it didn't look like it was going to work out right. So into the graphics card, out of the graphics card, into the CPU, because that's a nice easy bend. And then coming out of the CPU was the tricky part, because at first I wanted to go into the back side of this 120 millimeter radiator, but it's just too close. This tubing, it wouldn't make that corner without getting kinked, and I couldn't use a 45 because then that would end up, putting me way out too far beyond it. That part didn't work. So I went in straight out of the CPU into a 45 on the close side of the radiator, and then went out of the other side of the radiator with a 90 degrees straight down underneath both tubes for the CPU, and then into my reservoir. So it's a little bit different. I think it'll still work. I mean, obviously, I don't have any loops that are, looping back on each other, so it's all one big loop, so I know it'll work from a water path standpoint, but I think it'll work visually. It kind of seems to be working. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I almost went straight out the top and then down into a 90 and I might still give that a shot just to see what that looks like. I don't know. It's kind of interesting. I kind of like the part that goes underneath, though. Well, let's give it a shot. See what happens. I don't know. Which one do you think you guys like more? I'm kind of thinking I'm going to stick with this because I think logically it seems to work out a little bit better in my head to watch the flow of the water, whereas before, I don't know, I think it was a little more interesting when I went down, but I think I kind of like this more. So I think I'm going to stick with this. Alright, so this was the water-cooled InWin A1 in the least modified way, which is basically just 8 holes for fan screws, and I kind of dig it, so I'm going to give it a little bit of a whirl here. I've got it all set up, and unlike some of the builds that I like to put together, I did actually apply thermal paste. I did actually fill it with water, so I'm going to run it and see what it's like. I'm actually kind of mostly curious about that power supply. I want to see how that does because I know that that's, you know, it's passively cooled, and there's a lot of people that don't think that this case has very much airflow at all. They might be right, but it does have 4 fans in it still, and 3 of them are coming in, 1 of them's blowing out, and there's some mesh around where that power supply is, so I'm hoping it'll do all right, but I guess we'll find out. Yeah, I think that's about it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think in the comments. Take a look, see what you would want to do differently. Let us know. Maybe when I get around to part 2, which there's already a little bit of part 2 going on. I'll just say this feature's not standard. So when I get around to that, you know, maybe if you have some good ideas, I'll take a look at them and see if I can make it happen in the case. But till next time, guys, I will catch you later.